Suzanne, would you and Abigail introduce yourself and explain your project, the book model,
Book
whatever?
model collection, absolutely. Thank you for having us on your channel today. My name is Suzanne Glemot. I am collections care assistant at the University of Iowa Libraries, and part of my job is getting to work with a wonderful and unique collection of books that is housed in the University of Iowa Conservation Lab. The wonderful backdrop that we have behind us today, it is real, it is not a Zoom backdrop. So this is the book model collection. I'm very fortunate to get to work with our wonderful student assistant, Abby.
Yes, hi, I am Abby Whitford. I am a library and information science student here at the University of Iowa, and I just completed an internship here with the book model collection. And I was able to assist in cataloging, some accessioning, enclosures, and just general upkeep of the collection.
Okay, Suzanne, you had a number of things that you wanted to address. Do you want to go ahead and do that?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I wanted to give an overview of the collection. So it's um a bit different than a typical library collection in that the items that we collect here are really collected for their structure as physical books and not necessarily for the text that is in the books, because in fact most of our books are bound blank. They are models or examples of books from their time of production that aim to teach a whole range of users about the craftsmanship and the history of book production through time. So we have books that range through or models that range from the production of clay tablets all the way to the production of Kindles. So almost every, we're working on it, permutation of book structures in between. And we aim to serve classrooms at the university that have that touch upon material craft culture. So it could be lit classes, it could be the classics department, graduate studies in library and information science and at the Center for the Book. And so we're serving students, we're serving scholars, we're serving MFA candidates and librarians as well.
So, do you have any examples of the books that you have that represent a certain type of book during a certain period or periods of time?
Sure. So we have our books organized from so it's a very much an in-house cataloging system. But we organize our books by what we call century of prevalence. So the century where this book structure would have been most relevant or most in production or started to be in production. And we move chronologically from above my right shoulder over here and into the 20th century in that direction. But the collection started in the mid-80s under the care of the first university conservator, Bill Anthony. And he, along with his apprentices, created a core collection of bindings to study how books from different periods of times were made. Do we want to each grab one of the paired bindings? So we have a couple of books that seem almost identical and that are, they were made in the mid-80s, so very recent in our book history, but they replicate the sewn and wooden board structures of the Renaissance in Europe. And these were made in a very interesting context in that both an instructor, a teacher, worked with their apprentice and their student and built these at the same time. So we have a couple of these paired bindings, which are really lovely and feature very beautiful heavyweight paper to sort of mimic, this paper is machine made, but it seeks to kind of mimic the weight of the handmade paper that might have been used in bindings at the time. So these were bindings that were created really under the auspices of the conservation mission at the University of Iowa. We do have a concentration of European materials. This is a crowd favorite, and I'll let Abby show it and talk about it a little bit and how it was, if you're okay with that, talk about how it would have been used.
Yeah, so this is a girdle book that Bill Anthony also made along with his apprentices. And a lot of these core collection items were used in an exhibit at the University of Iowa, which brought attention to the idea of book structure and studying book structure. And that's really how the book model collection came to be.
Are these like artifacts, like to preserve the book model rather than have somebody use them?
That's a good question. It's a really hands-on collection. I think the way I like to pair a visit into this space is to maybe go by special collections downstairs first, where you have just as interesting materials from a structural perspective, but in the context of a special collection space, because those items are really meant to serve many users and researchers over time. There's really an emphasis on the care of handling and restricting maybe how the item can be used in order to be preserved for future use. So it's a delicate balance. And up here, we're a little more hands-on with these items, maybe in a special collections, an original girdle book, because there are so few that survive in their intact shape throughout the world because of how this leather would have been placed on the book. This was a way for a literate, usually clerical, what is the word I'm looking for? Monastic a person to have the text sort of attached to their person through this loop. These things don't survive over the centuries. They're delicate, they'll tear off. In a special collections, you could not lift this off the table and pry it open and try to get into its guts, so to speak, and figure out how it was assembled. And so the idea behind the model is both to learn how this was made, but also have the freedom to manipulate it in a way that you can't handle an item that's 500 years old.
You manipulate it, but you can't, basically, nobody can come in there and start writing in these or anything like that.
No, we have a wonderful guest book that we encourage people to write in, but in these items, there's nothing being added to these once they are added into the collection.
Well, I would like to see more of them. That's lovely.
There you go. I'll let Abby show this one off because she did a little bit of work documenting its history recently.
Yeah, so this is a model created by University of Iowa alum, Shauna Lino. And it's a Armenian style binding, but we had found that it ended up being more of a hybrid style. What was it more of?
It's been a month since we took those notes,
yeah.
So I can't quite remember. But the joy of a space like this is that we get scholars and specialists who come through. And so we recently had a scholar who specialized in the history of Armenian books, who said, who just like admired the craftsmanship and said how wonderful it was, and was able, because this is their trade, their bread and butter, to point out where it was in fact slightly different. I think one of the elements that the scholar pointed out was the the color of the leather, that the original would have been bound in perhaps either a less yellow or a slightly darker leather, right? Just like really slight subtleties. And then we get into questions of reproduction and historical accuracy. But in the case of someone who's making a model, right, part of it is you want to source really good materials, but you also work with what's reasonable and available. So that was one of the things that we learned.
Okay,
And
so you used what was available, but then what is the paper? It's not exactly handmade paper, but what kind of paper is it?
What is in this one?
seems like it's handmade.
This one looks like it's handmade paper. And if it is not handmade, it is a very well-made machine paper. But it does look, it has that texture and that finish as I'm looking at it. It does have a handmade quality to it.
So who would have made the paper?
Good question. I can't remember whether Shauna makes her own paper, and if she did not make it herself for the model, she probably sourced it through the community affiliated with the University of Iowa Center for the Book, since there is such a robust paper making practice, you know, local to the university in Iowa City.
Wow, that's amazing. I would love to see more if you have
Absolutely. I think this is always a really fun one for students to see. So one form of binding model that we have is what we call a cutaway model. And so instead of being fully covered and finished, sort of approaching the final form of the item, this item in particular reveals the layers that go into making a book. So it's not actually covered all the way with all of the materials, but it's almost like an archaeological excavation. So we can see the uncovered boards and the unlined stitching on the spine of the book, the sewing supports, and then we can see the layers that are built up on the spine to build the fine binding structure. And you can also see the different layers of work under the leather work and the gilding, the sewing supports that have been hammered out. And this is it's a weight book. It has a really good feel to it. But it is all machine made, you know, high quality machine made paper on the inside as well.
Suzanne, when you talk about high quality machine made paper,
Right.
what kind of paper, what constitutes a high quality machine made paper?
Oh, that's a good question. That answer can be approached from different angles, I think. I tend to speak from a craft and tactile sort of perspective since I'm also a maker. And so looking for papers that have, for me as a maker, I look for papers that have suppleness and that drape well as the pages of the book open, pages that will comply nicely with the opening and the full the action of the book. What are other qualities? A paper certainly that is made with non acidic materials. You know, the paper pulp has been made with care so that the paper can last. But then, you know, depending on if you're looking to work with a thicker paper or a much thinner paper, you're looking for, it just depends what the project is. Yeah, I don't know what you just worked with some papers. What were some of the things that you noticed between the different paper stocks that you worked with?
Yeah, so I have most recently done a binding structure that is of Japanese origin. So I was using a lot of Asian style paper, so a lot thinner. They're highly textured. When you're piercing a block of paper, you want it to be kind of buttery and smooth to push through. So I found really high quality Japanese paper to be wonderful to work with. And for a binding paper, you'll want different qualities than if it was paper you were going to write on. So this could be a good way of trying to tell the difference between like a journal and maybe a book structure, is some of these papers aren't necessarily the best to write on, but they're better to stab and manipulate into a book.
Absolutely. Yeah, right. It's a different priority in the binding and model making process than maybe the notebook that I'm grabbing as I'm running to a meeting and that I want to be able to take notes on.
So let's go back to the book the leather book that
Sure.
you said would be hung from, no, not that one, the Lou one that would be hung by
Yes.
a belt or something.
Sure.
Okay.
The girdle book. Yes.
So let's say a monk had this and he
Mhm.
hung it by his belt. What would be in it? What would he I'm sure they didn't have women monks. So what would he be doing with this? What would
Sure.
be in it?
So there were actually scribal communities of nuns that were really involved in book production as a fun rabbit hole to go down for those who are curious. So there were, yes, like writing and book producing communities of nuns, I think particularly in Italy, and then maybe in some now Scandinavian regions, if memory serves. Scholar Melissa Morton has done a lot of work and research on that. But for your average monk Joe, who might have been carrying this kind of artifact around, I think it would have been a manuscript devotional book. And this book structure is associated with some monastic Christian practices. So it may have been a book of hours or maybe a book of Psalms. I'm not quite certain exactly what would have been the content, but probably manuscript and some kind of devotional tool that they could have had to read, to meditate, to consult ritualistically, I
Now,
think.
who would have put that together? The community, or some scribe would have to have entered the devotional, the book of hours, the manuscript aspect of it. What?
Right. Yeah, I would have. So a manuscript, like all manuscripts were produced, a lot of them in scriptoria. So in production centers devoted to these religious texts, it probably would have been produced there, and then acquired by the community to serve in the religious life there.
Okay, now when I was up there and I was first introduced to your area of books, you showed me a book that was, I got the impression from the Pharaoh's time or something. It was, do you remember the book? It was,
Hmm.
um,
Oh, we pull so many.
well, keep showing and don't let me interrupt you. Maybe
No,
you'll show up.
it might show up. What are a few more that
And
we have?
I will know when it shows up.
Yes, please
Because
shout when you see it.
I have
Um,
such a good memory, like a sieve.
I that's me these days, so I understand. So a lot of our history, as I mentioned, just because a lot of scholarship around books for a long time, at least in America and in Europe, was very Eurocentric. I think to your question about what is reflected in our collection, right? We have had many more models made of books held in historical European collections than other parts of the world. But I think items like the Armenian style binding are an effort of the collection and the interests of people who are making these books to expand our understanding of what books are and what is worth being studied as well. But we have a lot of, and I think, the Middle Ages, the Renaissance loom large in our minds, in our imaginations. But some of my favorite items are actually more recent in our book history. We have a couple of examples, actually a lovely pair of books that our very own Beth Stone, who you, I think, had on your show a couple
on my
weeks
YouTube
ago.
channel. Yeah, to talk about ephemera.
She made these models, and they are examples of, let me make sure I don't misspeak on this, read the label, German paper case bindings. So just a more recent development in the last 2-3 centuries, I would guess.
Is that what you're
book
calling
structures.
recent? We have to get a definition of recent. Last 2 and 3 centuries.
I think I've gotten to the point where recent in my mind is like anything post the advent of the mass production of books. So post mid 1800s. And I'm sure any number of people would challenge me on that, but that'll be recent in my mind.
Okay. Just so we're clear, when somebody's watching this who isn't familiar with that, and you say recent 3 centuries ago, then by definition, what is recent?
Yes. Yeah. No, I appreciate you asking for that clarification. But they're such charming books. They have just such a lovely format. They're finished with handmade paste papers, which has a long history in the production of books. And they almost feel more intimate in their size, right? This could be a journal or a small book, or small printed book. So these are some of my favorite items in the collection.
Now, I noticed when you pulled it open, Abigail, do you want to open yours maybe? I no, yours is, that flipped open and the binding was, the spine was not attached.
Correct. Yes. So Abby is holding a version where Beth finished the book entirely and applied all of the adhesive to the flyleaf and adhered it to the front cover. And in this model, we get to see what the binding looks like before, again, another variation on that archaeological kind of model making, where you can see all of the different components before they're finished and hidden, because a lot disappears in the finished book.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And that's where a collection like this is sort of an advantage to look at the structure, because if you go into a library like Special Collections, you might be able to see some of the internal structure of the book, but because of the nature of the items in there, you can't pull it apart and really look at it and see like maybe what type of thread is there, or what type of paste they used, or what kind of binding style they used either. So that's what's nice about these, is you have the freedom to really look at them without fear of ruining something,
being chased out of Special Collections permanently.
Yeah.
So go ahead, show me more.
This is kind of one of my favorite off branches of our collections, but our collection includes 16 Kindles.
Wow.
From we range from the 1998 Rocketbook all the way to the 2014 Kindle Voyage. And this is just one of the earlier Kindles with the keyboard system at the bottom. So it's insofar as the book model collection has expanded over time to reflect just different technologies in carrying texts and holding texts. The e-reader is part of that conversation. So we have these sitting on shelves right next to these little handmade beauties.
So the text on the Kindle, is it any special book or is it just a
No, it's
sample?
it is an empty battery notice.
Oh, okay.
We're slowly resuming a schedule of maintaining these devices, right? Once a binding is safely enclosed and on a shelf, it doesn't require a lot of maintenance. The electronic devices kind of have their own schedule and demands on our time.
You know, I was going to ask you about that. Does your room have to be temperature controlled or anything, or is it all the way available uh to be to breathe on or whatever, you know?
Or I think by default we house every single one of our items, and that parallels, I think, practices in special collections 2 floors beneath us. You've spent time in those ranges and those stacks, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the collection is physically located in the reading room of the conservation lab. So we benefit from the climate control that the lab gets to preserve its items. So we happily benefit from those environmental controls up here.
But not necessary.
Not immediately necessary, but if we do want these teaching items to last and hopefully serve a few generations of students, you know, it is still leather, and so it will still fail over time, in the same way that a 6-century-old leather is failing or just aging naturally. So we do want to, as much as possible, keep this collection in climatized conditions, in order to preserve its usability.
Okay, now you did say to preserve the item. Do you request people to wear gloves, talking about leather,
Sure.
when they touch your manuscript so that the oil from the hand does not get on the leather?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think it's twofold maybe. So we follow the same protocols that any special collection would in terms of stewardship. So we do ask users to come in with clean hands, just freshly washed hands, soap and water.
Okay.
Just as most all special collections that hold books, I don't even know where a pair of gloves is up here. It is not a favored practice actually to have gloves on, because gloves, unless someone has a particular allergy, so to protect the user, or if the book is covered in metal or enamel, where it really would be sensitive to any small amounts of natural oils on the hands. Since this is a collection about touch, right, and how a book functions mechanically in the human hand, bare hands, I think, are actually really important to be able to feel and know how the different parts of the book work together. And in addition, because folks actually handle our books so much, some of them are starting to develop a patina from the hands of users, which adds to the life and the understanding of the model. We have a model here that was made by Conservator Emeritus Gary Frost, and it's made from Todd parchment. So when he got
What
it, it
is
would have
Todd
been
parchment?
it is so this is an experimental material that was developed by the Pergamena Tannery in New York. They make leathers for all sorts of functions, and one of them is for bookbinders. And so they tried to apply a different chemical process to parchment than is normally done, to try to make it a little more pliant, more supple, and perhaps an easier covering material to work with, because parchment is very rigid and very fussy in many ways to work with. But Gary would have gotten this as a very bright white sheet of skin, and it's very subtle, and I don't know that the camera will capture it, but it's starting to get a little grayer because, you know, people are holding it, and spending time with it, you know, in their warm hands and opening it to see just how the book functions.
Well, some items I'm sure are made more how do I want to say this? Made more like they were by the touching of the hands, like
Yes.
they become more supple or become more do you
I
know
think
what
you're
I'm trying
spot
to say?
on. No, absolutely. I mean, you know, this would have been brand new in 85 when it first went on exhibit, but you can start to see the scuff marks, right, from the metal hardware that's been removed on and off dozens and dozens of times. And so it is starting to give that age to the book that makes it almost a more accurate model because it has that wear versus
Been used.
this beautiful item that hasn't quite been handled in the same way just yet. And so the leather is bright and yellow and shiny still. I think that's spot on, Anne.
Do you have anything from like ancient times, like
Sure. Yeah. We were just talking about this one, so I'll let you show it off, Abby.
Sure. One of the earliest forms of the book was actually in the form of tablets in the ancient world. So this is a wonderful example of a clay tablet that would have been used in the ancient world. So it's very small. It would have been inscribed with it would be like a receipt almost. But yeah, this is one of the most earliest forms of the book, and it's not in a codex, but it was a way to record information in the ancient world.
Abigail, when you say receipt, what do you mean by receipt? You
Sure,
don't mean something we get at the counter at Walgreens.
it could be similar, yes. So in the ancient world, they might not have access to paper in the way that we do. So when you're making exchanges with governmental powers in the ancient world, you don't have paper to document like money transactions. So, for example, there would be someone there with the tablet like this, and they would be inscribing that type of information. So this is an example of a Sumerian tablet, but we have tablets in Greek, some in Latin too. Yeah.
Yeah, this would have been way pre paper, pre parchment, but I think humans have had a need to record keep for a long time. And so this is when, you know, I think amongst the earliest surviving forms of record keeping through symbols. And so someone was saying, okay, so we've decided that this exchange of goods or the purchase of this herd of heifers is important enough that we have to record it. But so, and it's you just have two sides, and it's just a very you know, it really just does fit. I mean, it's the size of a receipt. It just fits in the palm of your hand. So this is certainly not although I would be on the lookout for one, but not an original, but a replica that a maker just had the experience of, you know, what is it like to model the clay and what is it like to hold it in their hand and inscribe it, and then cured it and preserved it for us.
You brought down something, so what was it?
I did. So much older in our history, and this is a favorite of bookbinders and model makers, is the Stonyhurst Gospel. So it dates back to the 7th century. This is just a really lovely small format. I think this
Wow.
is approximating the the size of the actual gospel, and it has a relief pattern on the front cover, and inside would have had just, it being a gospel, so it is a concentration of text, but in a really small hand, we can imagine. And something that I like to think about too when we get into these smaller formats, we're holding this, and then I also have my personal device, right? Like there's something about this format and size somehow that's being transmitted down through time, right? Like this is a personal cell phone, a personal device that I read on. And this is obviously not exact ratios, but it feels about the same in weight. It feels the same in shape. So it's kind of neat to think about what are these forms that we're attracted to as makers over time.
Who would have carried, who would have had this book that you just showed?
Yes, this would have been in a monastic and religious community. And I'm afraid that at this point in the semester, I don't remember my Stonyhurst gospel history beyond its role in book model making. Do you remember?
For this exact gospel, no, I'm not sure exactly what monastery it would be in, but during this time period, a lot of these books would be held in religious institutions for access for the ministers.
For the religious communities that lived in them. And I think this goes into the reason that it is of interest is because it is going earlier into the history and permutations of assembling books with multiple signatures, right? With multiple gatherings of leaves. And I will to remedy my lack of recall right now, I'll send links about the Stonyhurst Gospel that can maybe be included in the description of your video for folks who would want to follow up on it.
Okay. What about one last thing? I love the clay tablet. Is there anything else that is about that time period?
Yeah. So going way back as well, third, fourth, I think early 4th century, we have some models of so these also come out of religious communities, just because religious communities around the world tend to be very good about preserving their texts because they are of ritualistic importance and because they invest a lot of time and resources in their production. And so there's a collection of codices, so of books that were found in Egypt, known as the Nag Hammadi codices, and they preserve early Christian texts. They're basically just kind of pamphlet shapes, but that were written on papyrus, and some of them bound in these wonderfully supple leather covers, and have survived through time because the environment that they were preserved in Egypt just held the parchment and the leather together. So we have this is a model that features pages that are made from papyrus. And this is definitely contemporary papyrus, but I think imported from Egypt. And this really beautiful red leather cover, and it's attached with these great little tackets, so twisted small pieces of leather that connect the folded papyrus to the cover of the book. And then there are these great pieces of leather that also help wrap the item and protect the item.
It's amazing. It's like an envelope, a large envelope that
Absolutely.
it's really like an envelope. It would be like what we use today for our wallets or something.
It's wallet. I know, I'm looking at it in the camera like, oh, this would be a really cute wallet, actually.
Okay, there goes Suzanne with that book to
Yeah.
use as a wallet.
There we
I
go.
can
Yeah.
see it. I can see her wrapping this at food for
know.
thought, wrapping.
Right. Exactly. Have everyone in line behind me resent the same process. But yeah, so this is, I mean, and this is just a smattering. We have almost 300 items in the collection.
That's my dog gone crazy. Somebody must
I
be
heard.
walking down
I
the
heard.
street. Okay, well, if there's any other kind of book that is from a long time ago that you want to share, I would love to see it, and then we can wind it up if you want, or keep going,
Sure.
however you feel about it.
No, I'll let you, if you have other questions related to your channel, and your practice, we'd be really
Well,
happy to
I
chat.
think what's interesting is that I started this when I was COVID bound
Mm,
at home, and I didn't do any videos, but I started watching YouTube, and I started watching something called junk journals.
okay.
And what I watched is women working, mostly women, although there are a few men working on monoprints and jelly on a
Mhm.
jelly plate and making books and pretty much making them out of anything. The covers being made out of cereal boxes, some of them, not all of them. Papers that they had put together. That was what I talked to Beth Stone and Elizabeth Reardon
Mhm.
about. You know, not necessarily archival material. And Beth pointed out that, yeah, but it saves it from going to destruction at at the landfill or something, you know.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so I became fascinated by it because it seemed like these women were creating an industry of their own, you know, that they were marketing, selling,
Mm,
their children were coming in and, you know, uh, the children were helping paint while not all the children, but many of the children, you know, that they were at home making these things. And so it started to fascinate me.
mm,
And I just became fascinated. I've always been fascinated by books. This was not, but I became fascinated by the making of
right.
something right in front of me. You
Right.
know, this is a signature, this is how it's put in, this is what
Right.
you do with it. Sure, they're not book models, they're not made up the finest machine paper that's available, or real Egyptian papyrus, or stone tablets. They're not any of these things, but it is still the making and creation of a book.
Right.
And it's a reflection of the person that is making it. They
Mhm.
say they're journals, but really they're not journals in the sense that I know a journal.
Right.
You know, my sense of a journal is you sit down, you write in in a journal, you know, like empty pages
Yeah.
or fine pages. These were not fine pages. So this is how this started. And then I just happened to somehow stumble into your area. And
Yeah.
I thought how neat it would be to show another feature of the
Right.
same thing. I think people don't understand that all the YouTube things that I'm talking about are journals or books
Mhm.
or that are created by people
Right.
with signatures, basically,
Right.
if they're not stone tablets. But even that going back to that stone tablet, you know.
Well, and I think you said something that got me thinking is that, well, they're maybe not made out of the best materials, but they're made out of the materials that were available. And I think to us in the 21st century, right, someone making this really lovely small codex is reflective of maybe precious materials to us because we're no longer used to working with leather. But at the time, this may have been or felt maybe more common than you know, not many people nowadays work leather in this kind of capacity, right? And so I don't know, maybe 150 years from now, we'll be making models of junk journals and trying to replicate the kinds of materials that were used in that practice, right? They feel, and not that they weren't, some of them weren't precious. I think that manuscript production is very prized and very expensive and laborious and resource intensive. But going back to the paper case binding, right? Paper is way more affordable and accessible. And that is a more economical way to finish and bind a book. So it's not so much about the preciousness, but about the history and the craft.
Right.
Yeah.
I agree. I concur.
Excellent. That's great. Well, anything else?
No, I would just love to see more. Like maybe we can do, I know everybody has just time crunches and this is finals week, and I'm really appreciative you both of you taking the time to meet with me during a very busy time for both of you. But if at any point we could do more of the collection, you know, more like going through time, you know, like from the tablet. We've done the tablet, but we've also
Right.
done modern,
Right.
like Beth, modern German
Yeah.
case paper book. So
And all the
anyway,
mysteries in between. Yeah,
right.
well, if it's okay, I'll also send you resources about the book model collection. We have a website in development that will
Okay.
help, because part of it is you can, of course, come in here and use this collection in person. But we're trying to make the collection at least searchable and helpful online within the limits of the digital format. So I will try to share some resources with you that give an even deeper overview of the collection as well.
Okay, but it's also fun to actually see it, you know.
Yes, yeah, come
I
in
wish I
person if you're
remembered what
local.
I wish I remembered what that book was, but it was from the time of Pharaohs. It was something that Gary said.
Oh, yes.
Right,
Well,
right.
let me, well, I think, I mean, this is the only one I could think of.
And Gary said, "We have that. Let me see it." And then you said, "Yes, Gary, we have that."
Well, only because it is very striking, but now I'm wondering if this is not it. Was
This is
that?
not it, but this is
Well,
still very striking. What is it?
it is a model of an late Coptic? Yes, late Coptic model. So Coptic relating to the community of Copts, which are a
Copts,
Christian community.
Christian community,
Yes,
Egyptian, Upper Northern Africa. Yeah.
yes, absolutely. So these are it's based on some of the bindings that are held at the Morgan Library in New York City, and have this very distinctive structure where the covers are made from the same parts that the pages are made from, and covered and tooled in leather with these really great small decorative elements throughout.
And somebody in our university does that. Actually did the covers like that.
And I think this is another Shauna Leno model. She was a student and attended and worked with the University of Iowa and worked closely with Conservator Emeritus Gary Frost. She's an incredibly accomplished toolmaker. She makes beautiful hand tools. I can't be a bigger fan of the things that she makes, but yes, a number of the models that we have in our collection we owe to Shauna and her craftsmanship.
All right. So Abby, what is your next move? What
Yeah.
what are you what are you gonna do next when you're not a student anymore?
Oh, when I'm not a student anymore? Well, I would hope to work in a special collections setting or a collection similar to the book model collection we have here. And I've also been doing some practice in book conservation as well.
Is the book model across the country, or is it very unique to us at Iowa?
Pretty unique to
unique.
us. There
Yeah.
are few conservation labs that have around the country that have models of their own.
And many labs or conservation practices or private conservators may have models of structures that they have built for their as part of their education and their own investigation, but as a collection that is intentionally curated for research and use and discovery. We are a pretty unique collection.
All right, on that note,
Yes, thank you so much,
knowing
Anne.
that you work with a very unique collection, it's lovely. Sometime pull out more books. Let me know when you're available and we'll go
Great.
through it again.
Thank
But
you
how
so much,
wonderful. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Anne. Have a great afternoon.
All right, thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.